Welcome to this week's Teaching and Learning Center Professional Development event. As many of you know, we meet every noon in real time on Wednesdays. And we also archive these for asynchronous viewing later. So if you see something today that you're saying, my colleagues need to see this, you go to the TLC webpage a couple hours after the event, and you'll be able to go and watch it. And it'll be awesome then too. We're going to begin today with a land acknowledgement. Ashley.
Okay, let me share my screen and sound. Don, can you see what I want you to see here? Perfect, thank you. Okay, here we go.
As the first land-grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, we acknowledge that the state of Kansas is, historically, home to many native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska.
Many native nations utilize the western plains of Kansas as their hunting grounds, and others, such as the Delaware, were moved through this region during Indian removal efforts to make way for white settlers. It's important to acknowledge this, since the land that serves as the foundation of this institution was, and still is, stolen land.
We remember these truths because K-State's status as a land-grant institution is a story that exists within ongoing settler colonialism and rests on the dispossession of indigenous peoples and nations from their lands. These truths are often invisible to many. The recognition that K-State's history begins and continues through indigenous contexts is essential.
Please remember
these truths
because we still remember.
Thank you. If you attend enough of our events and you're interested, we have the opportunity for you to earn professional development certificates, and my colleagues will drop the link into the chat for that information. We have professional development certificates both for graduate teaching assistants as well as for faculty and staff members. If you're faculty or staff member, you also have the opportunity to potentially apply to be a TLC fellow. Andie Faber is one of our TLC fellows, and she'll be our presenter today. Before we get to Andie today, give you a little bit of a sense of what's coming up in the next couple of weeks. Next week, we'll be having a teaching chat. A teaching chat is an opportunity for you to kind of raise any concerns or questions or things that you want to talk about. This year, we also kind of have a primary topic of things that we're going to kind of be ready to facilitate some conversation on. Our primary topic for next week is peer observation and other ways to improve teaching. For those of you who've ever had peer observation done, super scary, but super helpful. So we can talk about some of our experiences with that. And maybe if you're going to do that, things to look for, et cetera. The week after, we expect to be kind of an event that might be interesting to some of you. We're going to talk about TVALs 101. So for those of you who have been here a little bit, you understand that TVALs are how we collect student perception data on our teaching and the courses that we teach. We're going to talk to you about how to do it, why we should do it, and things to get the most out of that. So that'll be in 2 weeks. Looking forward to that one. I expect some people are going to have some comments that they want to make in that one. So looking forward to those. But before we get to those, we have the wonderful Dr. Andie Faber here today, who'll be talking to us about equity and assessment, reevaluating how we evaluate students. Andie, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for joining me on this dreary Wednesday. It's very like October-y. I like it. I just wish that I were curled up on a sofa under a blanket with a cup of tea and a good book. But here we are, and this is the second best thing, is talking about equity and assessment, something that I am very passionate about. Let's see if that'll. All right, can we all see my screen okay? Okay, excellent. So I'm going to start just with a quick bit about me and who I am. For those of you who do not know, I have got my PhD in Hispanic linguistics from UMass Amherst. I am currently in the Department of Modern Languages here at K-State. My research interests relate to bilingualism, second language acquisition, language processing, language attitudes, pedagogy, and ungrading, which is going to be more of the focus of my talk today. But all of that is going to inform what I talk about today. You'll see that in a little bit. I also coordinate the Spanish language program here, which is the first 4 semesters of the Spanish language. And I teach classes in Spanish language, linguistics, and pedagogy. So before I dive in, I like to know who is in the virtual room. So if you can take a minute in the chat to let all of us know who you are, where you're located in the K-State universe, both maybe physically, but more importantly, departmentally, where are you located? And if you want to include information on your teaching context. So what types of courses do you teach? Are they large classes, small classes, discussion-based? Any information on your teaching context? I'll give a few minutes to start populating the chat. Okay, ooh, philosophy, excellent. Everything in all the ways. Thank you, Don. Okay, recruitment and admissions, excellent. I know La Barbara, of course. Art department, welcome. College of Engineering. Ooh, I am loving this because I'm seeing a very diverse group of educators, which is so exciting because it's one of the things that I love about this Teaching and Learning Professional Development series is we really get to hear from different teaching contexts. And so I'm going to, perfect, psych sciences, management, okay. I know, Yasmin, what you teach. Excellent. So yes, I'm going to talk, my teaching context is that I primarily teach and design courses for small classes, typically discussion-based, interaction-based classes. But I'm also going to talk about ways that we can use assessment that can scale to larger classes as well. So just because my teaching context is with those smaller classes, that does not mean that that's the only focus that's going to be here. And I hope to leave a few minutes at the end to talk and think about what challenges you might experience in your specific teaching context and the ways that we can think about assessment for those. Okay, continuing on. So a little overview of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about diversity in language use a little bit, kind of what some of the things that I've done in my research that have led me to embrace a different form of assessment. Then we'll talk about assessments themselves and kind of what our objectives are, motivation and feedback, and I'll talk about pointless rubrics or pointless rubrics, if you must. We'll talk about those a little bit, how I assess students using pointless rubrics. So we'll start with a journey down the research rabbit hole. Some stats just about Kansas. So about 13% of Kansans speak a language other than English at home. There's also more than 160 home languages represented in the state of Kansas. As far as dialects, that information isn't tracked. And so there's really no way to, and it's also very difficult to identify one dialect from another. The lines get very blurry. But we know that there are different dialects spoken in Kansas. There's mainstream American English and African American vernacular English are like two major dialects that we have in the US that are spoken in Kansas. At K-State, we have 971 international students enrolled this semester from 91 different countries. And who knows how many Kansas State students speak a language other than English or in addition to English at home. I don't have that information. I have searched for it. I have not been able to find it. If anybody can find it, I would love it. But what we know is that if 13% of Kansans speak a language in addition to English, then it is very likely that we have students in our class who speak a language at home in addition to English with their families. And why, we'll talk about why that's important in a second. As I was preparing this talk, I came across this quote and I loved it and I felt like I needed to share it. So the remark that there is no such thing as a Kansas dialect rests upon a misapprehension of what is meant by the term. In just the same way that we speak of the flora and fauna of Kansas, we may speak of the dialect of Kansas. Standard literary English is always a little behind the times. It is the stuffed and mounted specimen in the museum. Dialect is the live animal on its native heath. I actually had to look up what heath was because I was not familiar with that word. It is an area of open, uncultivated land. So something new to learn on Wednesdays. So I like this quote because it encompasses, even though it was written over 100 years ago in 1892, I think it still rings true today that language use is very diverse and varied. There's a specific way that Kansans speak, but also there's a lot of different ways that we speak within Kansas. So just like with flora and fauna, there's a diversity of those things in Kansas. There's a diversity of language use. For example, people in liberal Kansas are developing a distinct accent due to the intense contact between English and Spanish. That's some research that was headed by our very own Dr. Mary Kahn in the English department. And so one thing that's important with this is that a bilingual is not the same as two monolinguals in one person. This goes for dialect as well. And so for students who speak a non-standard dialect and then also learn mainstream American English, they're dealing with two different dialects, and that can have an impact on how they process language, what they understand. What you say might not be, or the message that you intend may not be the message that they take in, and the way that they use language might not be what you expect, how you expect language is used. And this is important, and this leads me to a fragment that I came across that I thought was particularly interesting, and I wanted to share with the group that comes from Sonia Sotomayor's memoir from her time as a student when she was at Princeton University. So if you don't know, Sonia Sotomayor is one of the Supreme Court justices in the United States. So she had said, and I will just read you this excerpt. Apologies if you don't like being read to, but I'm going to do it anyway. So she says, Professor Weiss had minced none of her words, informing me that my English was weak. My sentences were often fragments, my tenses erratic, and my grammar just not grammatical. If I could have seen it myself, I would have fixed it. But what was wrong sounded right to me. It wasn't until the following year, when I took Peter Wynn's Contemporary Latin American History, that the roots of my problem were uncovered. My English was riddled with Spanish constructions and usage. I'd say authority of dictatorship instead of dictatorial authority, or tell it to him instead of tell him. I came to accept during my freshman year that many of the gaps in my knowledge and understanding were simply limits of class and cultural background, not lack of aptitude or application as I had feared. That acceptance, though, didn't make me feel less self-conscious and unschooled in the company of classmates who'd had the benefit of much more worldly experience. So I think that this is important because obviously I think we can agree that Sonia Sotomayor is an intelligent person, very accomplished, and she still struggled in college with feeling like her language use wasn't acceptable, and struggled in figuring out how to use language appropriately, and was able to recognize that this was not an issue of aptitude or application, but cultural background. Not all of our students get to that point where they're able to recognize that. And so the message that they get is that their language use is unacceptable. And for bilingual students, a lot of times the message that they hear is that both of their languages are unacceptable, that they speak both languages poorly rather than they speak like a bilingual. So this is related to the cycle of linguistic prestige. So we have the dialects that are taught in school are the dialects that socially prestigious people develop because they're highly educated. And so then they write grammar books and dictionaries about how the language should be used. And then that's taught in school, and the cycle repeats itself so that those who are educated then say like, oh, this is the way that you have to speak because it's the way that I speak, and it's the correct way because we've decided all collectively among the elites that this is the way that we should speak. So I would like to encourage that we start to be a little more critical of this cycle and think about language use as something that we can do to express ourselves and use fluently as a tool of communication rather than a tool of oppression to put people in their place and tell them whether they belong or don't belong. This is a quote from Gloria Anzaldúa. If you want to really hurt me, talk badly about my language. I am my language, and until I can take pride in my language, I cannot take pride in myself. So it's important to me that we embrace linguistic identities as we embrace all types of identities that our students have. We want to demonstrate that they belong in our classrooms and that they belong, that they deserve an education. And so how do we do this? Well, there's a quote that I think is very useful in terms of thinking about how we give feedback. So use motivating feedback by making your feedback informational rather than controlling, giving positive competence feedback, pointing out the value of accomplishment, right? So we think about giving them information rather than telling them what's right or wrong in how they're using language and in other aspects of the way that we evaluate them. So that brings me from my research little niche into a more broad how we evaluate students. Suggestions. So if we're talking about how to incorporate this information into the way that we give feedback, we want to provide information about industry or genre norms. And so whatever product we're asking them to produce, what is expected in our industry? What are the norms of the genre that we're asking, of the type of project that we're asking students to create? Rather than saying this is wrong, that these are the norms, right? Indicate when the message lacks clarity and offer suggestions to improve it, rather than saying, again, this is wrong. You can, instead of saying correct or incorrect, you can consider describing appropriateness. That in this context, people might not find it appropriate if you use this type of language, or people might not know, get the message clearly because there's some ambiguity here. So let's look at how to reduce those ambiguities. So that brings us to assessment at large. That's the background that got me to where I am. So I want to start with just types of assessments. You can break down types of assessments in different ways, but I think that this is good for our purposes here to think about. We can have diagnostic assessments, which occur before instruction and identify learners' current knowledge, attitudes, etc. Interim assessments happen at midpoints, track student learning progress, and measure teaching effectiveness. These are often used on a programmatic level to see how students are doing in a program. Formative assessments are throughout a course, and they monitor learning and provide feedback for growth. And then summative assessments are at the end of an instructional period and provide evidence of student knowledge and abilities. Summative assessments are the ones that I think really shine in our education systems here, as well as formative are also often used. Those are the two that tend to be most talked about when we're talking about assessment. So what's important for us to think about when we're thinking about what assessments we want to give our students, how we want to assess them in the classroom, is to think about the 5 W's, which is actually 4 W's and an H. So who is the assessment for? What information do we want to know? Why do we want this evidence? When is the assessment taking place? So not only when in the semester, when during a specific unit, but we can also think about when during the day. So if you teach 2 different sections of the same course and you're giving an exam, one exam in the morning and another section in the afternoon, there's evidence that shows that students do differently on exams, perform differently based on what time of day they're taking the assessment. And so taking this into consideration is important. And then how is learning being measured? So what I like to think about, why must the roses be red, right? If you haven't noticed, there's an Alice in Wonderland theme throughout. I like to give myself themes for presentations. It helps me focus, or at least entertains me. And that's what I'm all about. So if we imagine that the Queen of Hearts is a professor, say, of roses, and that she tells her students that at the end of the semester, they must produce red roses, we have to ask, so is it cheating to paint the roses red? Or is that an okay way to meet the goal? What learning is being demonstrated? So why do the roses need to be red? And what are students learning from this experience? So that brings us to ungrading for equity. Ungrading is a term that was coined in 2017. The concept itself has been around for a century, as long as traditional grades have really been a thing. But ungrading means raising an eyebrow at grades as a systemic practice. Distinct from simply not grading, the word is a present participle, an ongoing process, not a static set of practices. So I take an ungrading pedagogy in my classes, which shifts focus away from metrics and attempts to recenter attention on learning. This invites students to be participants in their own learning process. And the key tenets here are that evaluation criteria must be transparent. It's important that students know what they're being evaluated on. They should be actively involved in the evaluation process, which also helps with transparency. And learning objectives must be clear and relevant to students' lives. So students should be able to see what the connection is to their future goals, what they're trying to accomplish in their class, etc. There are different practices and techniques, a lot of different ways that you can do ungrading because it's just this refocusing attention on learning. I put together some of the more common ones, and I put them on a scale from kind of easier on the one side with minimal grading to more involved, requiring a lot more time on behalf of the instructor on the contract grading side. I'm going to focus here primarily on minimal grading and talking a little bit about how I employ that in my classes. I also do a lot of self-assessment, and I've talked in this group before about student-generated rubrics. So minimal grading, what we mean by that is using a simplified grading scale to make grading simpler, fairer, and clearer, because too many gradations can result in a challenging task for teachers and often fail to transmit clear information to students. So you can think like, what does an 87 mean? If a student gets an 87, like you have a general idea, like, okay, that's a decent grade, but it doesn't really provide a lot of information about what the student did well, what they could improve on. So potential scales for a simplified grading, a minimal grading approach. I like to go with the 3-tier. It's nice and simple, very clear, very effective. You can also go with a 2-tier like pass, fail, complete, incomplete, sufficient, insufficient. A 0 scale where it's just not collected, you just talk about it in class. There's also grade-free zones where you might take like the first quarter or the first third of a term and you say like, nothing's getting graded during this part. This is all just about learning. And then we'll get to grades a little later. So those are some different things that you can do. As part of this, I find that our typical grading scales tend to come with a lot of baggage. So points, percentages, and the A through F scale have a lot of baggage that come with them when students get an A or a C or whatnot. And so in my classes, I like to use visual markers that are distinct from points or A through F so that it's something different. And they get 3 options. So in my classes, students' work meets standards. If it meets the standards that we've set out, students get full points, full credit, right? But they see the check mark and they know that, okay, it meets standards. Approaching standards means most assignment expectations are met, but not all. And so then they get 70% of what the points are, but they see the orange circle. And if it's below standards where few or no assignment expectations are met, they get the red X, which is 40% of their grade. I can go into as well, I don't do zeros because mathematically zeros really pull down students' grades. There's a discussion in the world about eliminating zeros from the 100-point scale. Because of how much of an impact they have. If A is 90 to 100, B is the 80 range, C is the 70s range, then you get to F and it's 60 points. It just is, it's too skewed. And so I go with 40%. I can go more into that later if people have questions on that. But that's what I like about using the visual markers is that they see that X. And it doesn't look like I'm giving points for them having done nothing if they don't turn anything in. Do I assign zeros for work not submitted? Nope, they get the X. So if work isn't submitted, they get an X, it's below standards, and it's 40%. So again, so that it doesn't bring their grade down a huge amount mathematically. There's a whole mathematical thing about it. I don't do math, I'm a linguist. So how are you showing visual icon within Canvas? Oh, I'm so glad you asked. My colleague, Christina Bovian, and I, she's at Westfield State University in Massachusetts. We've been working on this for a long time, and we spent quite a long time trying to figure out how to make Canvas work for us, or she uses Blackboard. And so we were trying to figure out how to get our LMSs to work for us in this ungrading process. It took us a long time. We figured it out, and we wrote an article about it that came out recently. So I just dropped that in the chat. You can go into Canvas. That article explains how you go into Canvas. There's also a screencast at the end of that article where I go through and show how you do that in Canvas with its current settings. Exceeding standards. I'm going to get to exceeding standards right now. So I'm so glad you asked, Melissa. So that brings me to pointless rubrics. So I originally was trying to do this system with my old rubrics that were for kind of your traditional 100-point scale assignments. And I was getting frustrated because it didn't seem to mesh. It wasn't like, I just wasn't happy with it. Like I was like, oh, well, we'll use like what would have been a 90 will meet standards. What would have been a 65 will be approaching standards. And it just got like messy and wasn't what I wanted it to be. So instead I started creating my rubrics like this, which I call pointless rubrics because they have no points. So there's the holistic evaluation. I determine what are the main criteria. I usually keep it to 3 criteria, depending on the project. Sometimes I've had 4 or 5, but I try to keep it to 3 main criteria that I want students to hit in any given assignment. So I'll say, if it meets standards, it has done this, this, and this, right? So maybe it is organized, language use is clear and understandable, and it addresses the audience or whatever the thing is. So meet standards, the assignment demonstrates evidence of A, B, and C. Approaching standards, the assignment demonstrates 2 of the evaluation criteria. So either AB, AC, BC. And then below standards, the assignment does not demonstrate 2 or more criteria. So 2 or more of the criteria are not met. And then in the rubric, I have descriptions for, okay, criteria A, this is what it means to be acceptable. Like if it's fine, and this is what I want, this is where what I expect you to have, it gets acceptable. If it's below that, here are the things that would be insufficient for this assignment. And if it's outstanding, here are the things that I would see that would knock my socks off. And I would be like, wow, that is impressive. If students get acceptable or outstanding, either of those will go towards meet standards. So if they get acceptable or outstanding in all of the categories, they meet standards. If they do acceptable or outstanding in 2 of the categories, but 1 category is insufficient, they get approaching standards. And if they get insufficient in 2 or more of the categories, they get below standards. Importantly, I allow students to redo assignments. I use it as a learning experience. So if they do not meet standards, they have an opportunity to meet with me, review my feedback, revise and resubmit their work so that they can get it to meet standards. So this is something that I recognize can also be time consuming. We have a language resource center here. And so a lot of times I will have the students, if they are not meeting standards, I have them meet with tutors in our department to help them build their skills and what they're missing. All right. So back to getting into the chat and being interactive. So in the chat, if you are feeling participatory, feel free to respond to 1 or more of the following questions, being, in what ways do your students monitor their learning and get feedback for growth? Does your course use online learning platforms where it's based on like a percentage, they do activities and then they get like 70% or 93% based on how many answers they get right? Or do your students ever evaluate their own work? So I'll give you a few minutes to participate in the chat, should you so desire. Students evaluate their work and their classmates. Good. I love having students get involved in the evaluation process by evaluating their own work and that of others. Excellent. Reflections are great. McGraw-Hill, a science lab course. Weekly feedbacks in writing. Midpoint, evaluate their contribution. Nice. Midpoint and end of semester self-assessments. Excellent. Loving the self-assessments. Evaluate their contribution to a group as well as evaluating the other members. Feedback provided on assignments. Okay, so excellent. So lots of ideas of how we get students involved, and some of you who also use these online learning platforms, which we do as well. So for example, here, this is often what we see in a grade book, right? For an online learning platform is you have a bunch of assignments, a bunch of activities that the students have to complete, and they get certain numbers of points or percentages for each one completed. So you can take a look at this and you can see this first column here, like the student clearly is doing quite well. Even if we look at some of the lower rows, you can see students who are doing well, but maybe have missed, there's the 4th or 5th row down where it's like, some are like, okay, some are really high. And then there's one that's 15%. So when thinking about these assignments, these are assignments that we give students so that they can learn the course material, right? These are formative assessments that are auto-graded. That can help us a lot. It can give students feedback and they can track kind of how well they're understanding concepts and what they need to do and how they're applying them without requiring huge amounts of instructor time to go through and grade and give feedback. But as I was thinking about this, if it's formative assessment, right, and the goal is learning, and we recognize that learning involves making mistakes, I felt really uneasy about students losing points for getting answers wrong. I also really wanted to dissuade this idea of perfectionism. So with these assignments, the students can resubmit them. They have 3 attempts that they can do. So they can do it again, and get the best score out of the 3 attempts, which is great for learning. I think that that's important. But I also find that then there were the perfectionist students who were constantly, and you still see it here, constantly trying to get that full 100%. And that's not really a message that I want my students to have, right? There we go. So I think about what message do I want my evaluation system to send my students? I want them to know that their effort is valued, so they should get credit for putting in effort. Mistakes are part of learning. For me, that's very important. Mistakes are part of the process, and so I don't want it to seem that there's a penalty for making mistakes. Likewise, risk-taking should not be penalized. Their opinion of their own work matters, which is where self-reflections come in. And then connection of course content to their own goals is important, which again relates to self-assessment and thinking about kind of how the work connects. Doing all this, my goal is that students then become curiouser and curiouser, which leads to critical thinking, autonomy, and ultimately equity. So with that, I wanted to have some suggested reading. So the Drive book is about motivation. It's really good in terms of understanding like what motivates people and can be really helpful in thinking about how you want to motivate students, especially decoupling motivation from grades. Because if you read this book, you'll know that grades are not actually a motivating factor. We think that students will be motivated by grades, and they kind of are, but it's not the most effective motivator. The other two books, Undoing the Grade, just came out this year, as did Making Room for Impact. Those are great resources if you're thinking about taking on this type of approach and thinking about how you can make your assessments work more or be more effective in the classroom. I wanted to save time for questions, comments, concerns, things that you teach. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can go back to gallery view. If you have any questions, concerns, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or drop it in the chat and I will read it. The Power of Regret by Daniel Pink is wonderful. Ooh, I'll have to read that one. I've read his Win book, which is also very good. That's the one that talks about when a student takes a exam can have an impact on how well they do. Don.
So do you ever get any pushback from your students that the processes that you're doing that are equitable, they see as actually inequitable, because they're seeing, you know, for the instance, like I had kind of raised, that person didn't do anything and got 40% of the points. I worked really hard and only got 70% of the points, for instance. So do you ever get pushback on that? And if you do, how do you respond?
Excellent question. This morning, I was talking to my students before class as they were filing in, and I told them that I had this talk today. And I asked them if they had any comments that they wanted me to share about their experience with this evaluation process. And one student said, I think it's really helpful because I'm not as focused on the grade. I can focus on what I need to do well, and then how I can improve. I can focus more on like, what are the things that I'm on track for, areas that I need to improve. And she said, it makes me feel a lot less stressed. And then I have my contrarian student, who I'm a total fan of, who immediately was like, I have a different opinion. And said he prefers to have the percentages because it feels much clearer to him. He says, oh, I have a 95. If I have a 95 this week, that means that I can maybe be a little more relaxed, which then started a debate. The first student said, yeah, but if it's just meets standards, then it doesn't matter that it's 90, like it's the same. You're getting actually more points because you're getting 100% of the points if you meet standards. So it's interesting, but I have found that in other classes as well. There always tends to be a few students that are uneasy with change, who feel like the percentage system works a lot better because they can see exactly how they're doing. I think that this is interesting because the percentages are kind of made up. We make them up. And we say, based on our rubric that we've put together, you get a 93 and you get an 84, which I feel like is also, there's a little bit of arbitrariness to that as well. And so what it comes down to, and how I respond to those students, to respond to your question, Dawn, is that I do my best to just explain, this is why we do it this way. This is why I have done this. This is what I'm hoping to achieve. And students tend to, even if they don't like it, they tend to appreciate that there's a rationale and that there's a reason for, okay, like this is why you're doing that. I still feel a little uneasy about it. It also tends to be the high achieving students that are most uneasy with it because they've figured out how to play the game. And I have changed the rules, and they don't want to learn a new game. They want to play the game that they're already good at. And so I would say this morning when I asked my students, most of them said that they really appreciated it. And also I was like face to face with them. So there's maybe some bias there. They're like, no, Andie, we love your class. It's great. This is an awesome system. But I do also send them anonymous surveys at the end of the semester to get feedback and let them be more truthful without attaching it to who they are. And that tends to be the same, is that I get most of the students say that they really appreciate this approach. And there's always one or two who feel nervous about it.
So there are two other little points I want to kind of make, because I think some of the things that I do are maybe fit in this, don't fit in this, or whatever. But one of the things you kind of mentioned is like the math around the percents, right? So, the students say, I have a 95%, so I don't need to worry about this. I found that my students are not very good about understanding the weighting of assignments. So I'll have students who say, I had an A in your class until the exam, and then I lost my A. And it'd be like, you had an A in the class because we had reflections that you just get credit for up until then for a total of 50 points. The exam was worth 150 points. You didn't do very well on that. That's how math works. That counts 3 times as much as those others. And students have a hard time, I think, sometimes with that. So one of the things that I think we would both advocate is letting students know how much things are worth, and kind of helping that. The other thing that you said, and I think you and I are probably in agreement on this, but my students don't ever lose points, right? My students accumulate points. So I've never taken it away. It's just they failed to earn. And for that reason, and for the percentage reason, I always have my points listed, not my percents listed in Canvas, because you're accumulating points through the various assignments. So it's not that you only got 70% and lost the other 30, it's you earned 70% of the available points, and you're building your point total in my class toward 900, which is where you would then get an A. So it's never loss, it's always gain. And I think what you're doing is you're saying you're going to gain in my class at these various points, and I really like that.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I did mention earlier. I said something about losing points, and really I was saying that from the student perspective, because as much as I say you're earning these points, you're earning this, you're completing this, students still see it as if they don't get full points, that they've lost them. That's very ingrained in our system, and that's one of the challenges of this approach, is fighting against this system that is, I find myself sometimes when I'm talking being like, no, we don't do like regular grades in this class. Like, I have to figure out how to talk about it differently. Nathan.
Yeah, so this is a follow-up on Don's last point. So something I'm always uncomfortable with is the idea of just giving students the points even if they didn't turn in the assignment, which is something that you explicitly advocated for. And if you think about students earning points towards a goal of 900 or 1,000 or whatever at the end of the semester, I feel like this is particularly a problem because students are just starting with this, right? And I guess I'm old school in a lot of ways, and so I've always been uncomfortable with the idea that students start with an A and work backwards. And I think if you sort of do this kind of, building towards an end goal, building up your points throughout the semester in all sorts of ways, that handing out points for students who literally did nothing really undermines the whole project. So could you say a little bit about what you think there?
I would love to. So what I do, and why I have the markers, is specifically to the visual markers, is specifically to speak to that, because I agree there's something unsettling about putting in points when students did nothing. What I'm attempting to do is to raise the floor, so that instead of having 60 points, that is the F, you're only having a smaller amount of points, so that it corresponds better to, like I was saying, like there's 10 percentage points for an A, 10 percentage points for a B, 10 percentage points for a C, and for a D, and then 60 percentage points for an F. And that's the part where mathematically a 0, if you have a student who gets 100, 100, 100, 100, and then doesn't submit one assignment and gets a 0, that pulls their grade down way more than if you have a student who gets like mostly 70s, and like you can see the student who has 100, 100, 100, 100, and 1 0, they clearly are understanding the material, but maybe just failed to submit something. Whereas the student who maybe struggles a little bit more conceptually understanding the material, their average might end up being higher because they didn't get that 1 0.
Thanks, that's simple.
There's an essay that's called The Case Against Zero. So if you're interested in kind of reading a little bit more about the argument as to why not put a 0, you can do that. I do see that, like, it is unsettling to be like, ooh, like, I don't want to put in 50 percentage points for the student doing nothing. But by rigging the system to have it show up as an X, that really clearly indicates to students that they did not do what they were supposed to with that, without having that, like, oh, you get 50 points for doing nothing.
Yeah, I guess my concern is that we have lots of other tools which can accomplish the same goal without making it the case that students who do nothing until the final and then take the final and get a C pass the course, right? Which would happen on your system most likely. You know,
I mean, it depends
if we're
on how
flexible
you
about grades and we're flexible about late
Yeah,
penalties
like,
and that kind of stuff, we can accomplish the same goal. So I don't know. But
yeah, well, that depends also a lot on how you have your system set up. So if you have the final set up so that it's worth a lot of points, that could happen. That could not happen in my class. The final's not worth enough that it could raise their grade up if they were not doing anything in the class throughout the whole semester. So
Yeah.
it depends a lot on how you have the course set up. And that's an important piece of this, is thinking about, like, your course as a whole, how you want to design it, how you set it up. And like Don was saying, how you want to weight each thing, and being transparent with that as to, okay, is worth a lot, or these collective things are worth a lot. And if you don't complete them, that's going to have a pretty big impact on your grade.
Yeah. Thank you.
Andie, just
Yeah.
real quick, there's a couple of things I want to say. I think when you have control of your own class, where you are not taking on someone else's curriculum, with our freshmen, for instance, there are 11 sections of it. And we have to all teach the exact same thing, which doesn't happen in most schools. And we have a rubric that we agree we will use. And one of the ways that we make sure our new faculty understand the rubric is that we all get together and bring examples of a project. Every project that we do, we say, you got to pin them up, and we're going to all agree that whatever you think is a A or B or C or D or whatever, we all are sort of in the same range of grading that. But I especially like visual cues rather than numbers. So with me, I have pluses, check minuses, minuses that, first of all, give the student a chance to say, oh, if I'd done a little bit better, I might have made a check plus rather than
Mhm.
check or check minus. So that's one thing. But we also have a rubric that we're all required to use. And just for instance, we have exceptional, strong, average, below average, and unacceptable. And though I don't like average or below average, because what does that mean? Within a class, that could be different than somebody else's average. I think that it's there where I use those visual cues rather than numbers. That, but at some point, I have to balance that out and accumulate it into Canvas as a number. So that's where it doesn't always work, but I think it helps the student not look at the number on the grade sheet or see the notes on the grade sheet that tell them where their strength was and where their weaknesses are in that.
And that's exactly why I rig my Canvas courses to show up that if I put in 100, it shows up as a check mark. It doesn't show up as 100, it shows up as a check mark. If I put in 70, it shows up as an orange circle. And if I put an X, or if I put 40, it shows up as an X. That allows the students, so because those markers, those visual markers, are not attached to grades or points or percentages in the same way, students look at that and they go, oh, okay, I did enough to meet standards, or I didn't do enough to meet standards. And then they look at the feedback, because that's all there is. Like, there's not the, like, oh, I got an A, or I got a B, or I got a C. Like, they get a C and they go, oh, I got a C. And like they have all these like negative feelings because they wanted to get a B or an A. And so I feel like this system works better at pointing students towards that feedback, because that's a big part of it, is saying like, okay, these are the things you did well on, these are the things that you failed to do or failed to demonstrate. Here's how you can like the redoing part, revise and resubmit, is a big part of this too, so that when they fail to demonstrate their learning in something, they have an opportunity to go back and say like, okay, how can I fix this? What can I do to demonstrate that I have learned this?
And I think those things that you're speaking of can also be spoken to the class when the grade sheet, or when you're reminding them of what the class has done in a whole and how you evaluate those numbers, so that they do understand that. The other thing that we try to do is we weight the projects so they start out with less weight and they grow in weight. Understand students are going
Tom
to
just posted that in the chat as well, which is that's very similar to the kind of grade free zone, like where you start the first assignments have no grades attached to them, you just give them feedback. And then as the semester goes, you say, okay, now, because when you think about it, you know, week 2 of the semester, what learning are students demonstrating, right? Like they haven't had time to do much learning in the semester so far. And so asking students to demonstrate their learning in week 2 is seems a little precocious.
well, you can talk about them, but the
Yeah, well,
grade.
I mean, at that point, you should be doing formative assessments, which are focused more on learning. And again, like I feel like attaching a grade that's like, oh, you did excellent on your learning here, it seems weird. Like it's like, no, they're supposed to get it wrong at first. Like that's part of the process, is that you don't necessarily get it all right. And if you try and fail miserably in your first attempt at learning, like that's okay. That should be okay. At least that's how I feel in my pedagogy. And so I want my assessments to reflect that. If you don't feel the same way in your assessments, you should have your assessments reflect what you believe and what you want from your students. And so that's kind of what I would say is the thesis of this talk, is think about what you want students to demonstrate, what values you want to transmit, and then think about if your assessments are supporting that or undermining that. We're getting towards the 1 o'clock hour, but I think we still have a few minutes if there's 1 or 2 more questions or comments.
So Andie, how would you start this? Right. So I'm wondering if there's like a dip in the toe in the water kind of introduction to kind of see if this is going to work, because I think for a lot of us, this would be a little bit of a shift, from what we're doing. So what would you kind of see, like before we completely come over to a system like this without really knowing it, what would be the gradual way to do this?
That's an excellent question. So you can start by just doing this for 1 or 2 assignments in your class. You could say something like, for this assignment. So one of the nice things with Canvas, once you finally figure out how to rig the system, is that you can employ different minimal grading scales, whatever grading scale you create. So you can have regular points, percentages, A through F scale on other assignments, and then just pick 1 or 2 assignments that you say, I'm going to try this different grading scale for just this assignment. And I would be fully transparent with my students and say, like, I am curious about this type of evaluation. I would like to try it and see how it goes and see if it works for you, and do it with 1 or 2 assignments. And then get feedback from the students. What did you like about it? What worked? What didn't? By just doing 1 or 2, you can get that feedback and then decide like, okay, what works? Because that's another piece of this, is that there's a lot of trial and error. Like I said, with the rubrics, when I first started this, I was using the minimal grading scale with a regular rubric, and it just didn't feel right. It just wasn't working. And so part of the thing when you go against the system is that you have to create your own new system, which is also why I always encourage lots of reading, because there are people who are working on this. So read about what other people are doing. Think about what would work for your teaching context and what you feel comfortable with. And then think about, okay, how could I do this for just maybe 1 or 2 assignments or one type of assignment in my class? So if you have maybe like certain type of essays that you give them, short essays that they have to write every so often. Maybe just for the essay assignments, you will have this type of grading scale, but for the other assignments you have, there'll be your traditional system of grading.
So Andie, do you have a final thought to offer us?
Ooh, just one. I think I'll leave it with just thinking about what we want our students to learn and be able to do. I think that for a lot of us, it's not just those of us who care deeply about teaching. It's not just about our course content. It's about developing students who can think critically. It's about giving them opportunities to engage with different ideas and to discuss them. And so thinking about ways that we can have our assessments not just reflect the knowledge that they're gaining in the course, but different skills that are going to ultimately help them in the real world when they're off in their personal and professional lives beyond college. What are the things that are going to help them, and figure out ways to bring those into our assessments.
Excellent. Melissa actually has a question in the chat. Do you have a particular student success story you'd like to share?
Ooh, I don't have one right off the top of my head. I've had a lot of really positive comments of this. I would say, rather than a particular student success story, the thing that most stands out to me is that in my Spanish 4 class, when I started doing ungrading, I gave them the survey at the end of the semester to ask, and one of the questions was, what is the number one thing you learned in this class? And I was kind of blown away by the number of students that said that I don't have to be perfect. That was something that I was just like, wow. A lot of students have been feeling a lot of pressure. And so, yeah, like it was just like, oh, there are these students that are feeling like I have to do everything right. And that they suddenly have this ability to say like, oh, if I make a mistake, it's okay. And I'm being encouraged to try something new, try something different. And if I take a risk and it doesn't pan out, it's okay. It's gonna be fine. Because the worst thing that's gonna happen is that I'm gonna say, this doesn't approach standards because of this. And then you have an opportunity to revise and resubmit it based on feedback. So it reduces kind of the stakes a little bit and allows students to focus on their learning.
Excellent. Thank you. Oh, we actually, Yasmin has their hand up. Yasmin.
Yeah, thank you, Andie, for this wonderful speech or conference, or I don't know what, but I have a question. I completely agree with the system in the sense that we are not punishing the students that don't perform well, but then with this system, the thing that I see is that we don't promote excellence. So how we reward students that want to go beyond the mid standards. So there is not any reward for, I think that with this system, we are not promoting excellence. I understand and I agree that we don't
I
want
would
them to be
encourage you
perfect.
to read the book Drive, because the reward here for those students who go above and beyond is their own learning. For students who are really motivated to learn, truly learn, the learning and their knowledge that they did really well on something is its own reward. And so students are more motivated by knowing that like, ooh, I wanted to do this well and I did this well, than by a grade that says that they got an A versus a B. So that's how I would respond to that one. But yes, that is something that comes up, and it is something that you have to address, that, yeah, there's not a distinction between fine and great, but I think that makes it more fair for the students.
Okay, thank you.
We are at about 1 o'clock, so thank you, Dr. Faber, for a wonderful presentation. We'll be dropping a post-event survey link into the chat. Please check that out. I'll remind you that we'll push this up on our website, so you'll have the opportunity for asynchronous viewing. A couple of you have reached out and said, can you have that link? Yeah, when we have it ready, we'll send it out to the people who asked for it. but we are very excited to think about grading or ungrading in new ways kind of moving forward. As always, Wednesdays at noon, we will be meeting in real time, archived events available for asynchronous viewing on our webpage. Next week, we're going to have a teaching chat where bring some questions, bring some issues, but we'll also be talking about things like peer observation and other ways to improve teaching. And then 2 weeks from today, I'm going to be giving a presentation called T-Vals 101. We'll talk about how to do them, why we do them, problems with them, all of those kind of things. So really looking forward to that. As always, thank you all for being here today. Thank you for all you do with your students, and have a great rest of your afternoon.